The morning sun had barely touched the edges of the old curtains when Sarah's alarm began to ring. It was 5:30 a.m., the same time it rang every day, without fail. She opened her eyes slowly, her body aching from yesterday's long hours at the diner, her mind already running through the list of things she needed to do before the day truly began. The rent was due in 3 days, her son, Ethan, had a school trip next week that she hadn't yet paid for, and the grocery list on the refrigerator door was getting longer by the hour. She turned off the alarm, sat up, and looked at the small bed beside hers. Ethan was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. For a moment, she allowed herself to smile. He was the reason she got up every morning, the reason she pushed herself when her legs ached and her heart felt heavy. Life hadn't been kind to her, but she refused to let it take away the one thing that still gave her purpose. Sarah quietly got dressed, pulling on her worn shoes and tucking her hair into a bun. She made breakfast, 2 slices of toast, an egg, and a cup of instant coffee for herself. She always told Ethan that she'd already eaten whenever he asked why she never had more, but the truth was simple. She wanted to make sure there was enough for him. By the time Ethan woke up, sunlight had started to fill their tiny apartment. He was 7 years old, bright-eyed, full of questions and energy that Sarah could never quite keep up with. "Mom, are we still going to the park this weekend?" he asked, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Sarah hesitated. She had agreed earlier in the week, but now she wasn't sure if she could afford to take a day off. The diner was short-staffed, and missing a shift meant losing the tips that often made the difference between paying bills and falling short. "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly. "We'll go." Ethan smiled, and that was enough. After she dropped him off at school, Sarah caught the bus to the diner. It was an old place on the corner of Maple Street, with cracked tiles and the smell of coffee always hanging in the air. She tied her apron and greeted the regulars with the same warmth she gave every day. Most of them didn't know her story, and she preferred it that way. To them, she was just Sarah the waitress, always polite, always smiling, even when her hands were trembling from exhaustion. Her coworkers often wondered how she managed to stay so positive. They didn't see the quiet moments when she'd stand in the storage room, close her eyes, and breathe deeply just to stop herself from crying. They didn't know about the nights she stayed up past midnight helping Ethan with his homework or the mornings when she skipped breakfast so he could have a better lunch. By noon, her feet ached. By evening, her back screamed for rest. Still, she kept moving. She had learned long ago that the world didn't stop for tired single mothers. When her shift finally ended, she collected her tips, a handful of crumpled bills and a few coins, and tucked them carefully into the envelope she kept hidden in her purse. That envelope was her lifeline. It held the money for rent, bills, groceries, and sometimes, if she was lucky, a small surprise for Ethan. That night, after dinner, Ethan showed her a drawing he made at school. It was of their tiny apartment, with a stick figure of him and one of her holding hands. Above them, in shaky letters, he had written, "Me and Mommy, my hero." Sarah felt something inside her break. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "It's beautiful," she whispered, pulling him close. "You're my hero too." When he went to bed, she sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. She thought about the life she once imagined, a husband, a home, a sense of stability, and how quickly it had all disappeared. Her husband had left when Ethan was barely 2, leaving behind nothing but debts and broken promises. She had no family nearby, no one to lean on, but she had learned to survive. Sometimes, survival was all she could offer. A few days later, Ethan came home from school with a flyer. It was about a class trip to the Science Museum, $15 for transportation and lunch. His eyes sparkled as he handed it to her. "Can I go, Mom? Please?" Sarah smiled, though her heart sank. $15 wasn't much, but in her world, it was everything. She nodded anyway. "Of course, baby. I'll take care of it." That night, she counted her tips again. She had just enough for the rent and groceries, but not enough for the trip. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small stack of bills. Then she made her choice. The next day, she brought home fewer groceries, no coffee, no extra milk, no snacks for herself. It was worth it when she saw Ethan's excitement the morning of the trip. He hugged her tightly before boarding the school bus. "You're the best mom ever," he said, his voice full of joy. As the bus drove away, Sarah stood on the curb for a long time, waving until it disappeared down the street. The pride she felt was mixed with a deep ache, a quiet kind of pain that came from giving everything and having nothing left for yourself. That evening, when Ethan came home, he couldn't stop talking. He told her about the dinosaur bones, the space exhibit, the sandwiches they had for lunch. He spoke so fast she could barely keep up. Sarah just smiled, watching his face light up. She didn't tell him that she'd spent her lunch break sitting outside the diner with nothing but a cup of water. She didn't need him to know that part. Years passed like that, one small sacrifice after another. Each one unnoticed by the world, but felt deeply in her bones. When Ethan got older, he began to notice more. He noticed how his mother's shoes were always worn out before she bought herself a new pair. He noticed how she always told him to eat first, even when she barely touched her own food. He noticed how she never complained, even when she should have. In high school, Ethan got a part-time job at the library. He started saving his money quietly, hoping one day to surprise her. One evening, as he came home early, he found her asleep at the kitchen table, still in her uniform, her head resting on her arms. The dinner she'd made for him was cold, untouched. He stood there for a long time, looking at her, realizing for the first time the weight of her sacrifices. He whispered softly, "One day, Mom, I'll make it all up to you." Years later, that promise became real. Ethan worked hard, got a scholarship, and went to college. Sarah cried the day he left, not because she was sad, but because she was proud. The years of struggle, the endless nights, the skipped meals, they had all led to this. Time moved on. Sarah grew older, her hands lined and rough from years of work. She still lived in the same small apartment, still woke up early out of habit. One morning, she received a letter in the mail. It was from Ethan. Inside was a plane ticket and a note that said, "Pack your bags, Mom. You deserve the world now." When she arrived at the airport, Ethan was waiting, taller and stronger than she remembered. He hugged her so tightly that she could barely breathe. "You did it," she whispered through her tears. "You made it." He shook his head. "No, Mom, you did. Everything I am is because of you." That evening, he took her to a small house, her new home, bought with his first year's salary. It wasn't grand, but it was beautiful. There was sunlight streaming through the windows, a little garden out back, and for the first time in decades, peace in her heart. Sarah stood there quietly, her eyes filling with tears. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "You did everything for me. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night. This isn't repayment, it's gratitude." That night, as she lay in her new bed, Sarah thought of all the years that had passed. The hunger, the exhaustion, the loneliness. None of it seemed to matter anymore. The world had finally come full circle. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and for the first time in her life, Sarah allowed herself to rest without worry. She thought about how often people talked about heroes as those who wore uniforms or saved lives. But she knew the truth. Real heroes were often unseen. They were mothers who skipped meals so their children could eat, fathers who worked double shifts to pay for school books, single parents who carried the weight of two hearts alone. Sarah's life had been filled with sacrifice, but it had also been filled with love, the kind of love that gives everything and asks for nothing in return. And as she drifted to sleep, a smile touched her lips. Because now, finally, she knew that every struggle, every tear, and every sleepless night had been worth it. The next morning, she woke up not to an alarm, but to the sound of birds outside her window. She stepped outside, feeling the soft grass under her feet, breathing in the clean air. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing to catch a bus or count her tips. Ethan joined her on the porch, handing her a cup of coffee. "Mom," he said, looking at her with the same love she had seen in his eyes as a boy, "I want you to stop working. Let me take care of you now." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of pride and gratitude. "I don't need anything, Ethan. You've already given me more than I ever dreamed." But deep down, she knew that her sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. They had shaped a life, built a future, and turned a little boy into a man who understood love better than most. And maybe, in the quiet language of sacrifice, that was the greatest reward of all. Years later, when Ethan told his children bedtime stories, he didn't tell them about superheroes or fairy tale kings. He told them about a woman who worked 2 jobs, who never complained, who gave everything she had for love. And every time he finished the story,